Okay, thanks for the opportunity to speak at the conference today. What I want to really talk about today is we talk a lot about circular economy, but actually what I want to try and talk about is how do we measure that? What's the data around that? We all know it's a value, we all moving in that direction, we all know it's a priority, but actually how do we measure success within the circular economy environment? So I want to quickly talk to you about who we are, what circular economy is, looking at some of the existing metrics and some of then the change in focus and priorities around those metrics and where we as councils, we as an industry sector may need to look at going forward. Very quickly, just who we are. We're a large multinational company, been around 100 years, 40 offices, 3,000 staff. We've just got an office now in Sydney, Australia, so we're very committed to wanting to come and work in this market, which is hence why here today and other conferences to try and help communicate, I guess, some of the messages and some of the learnings that we've been bringing over from the UK. I won't go into this too much because I know it keeps getting reminded to us. There's a really good speak from Mark this morning around where the change in priorities is. And we've moved from waste management to resource management to now circular economy, which means we're no longer about not hurting the environment, not killing people in terms of the waste management sector. We're no longer necessarily about recycling. Recycling is the second worst option to landfill. We're very much around what are we doing in the circular economy to design out this way self-sustaining energy and resource use. Those is where our priorities is. But when we're doing that, we've got a couple of challenges. Some big challenges ahead, which I'll pick up in a second. This diagram has been overused, but actually a really good reference. Everybody knows what it is. I'm not going to talk about it in a lot of detail of what it is, because you all know what a technical and a biological cycle is by now, or should do. What I would point out, though, is if you think of us as a sector, all we really look at is the outer loop in terms of what we measure, in terms of recycling, what goes to composting. We don't measure what happens inside. Who measures in terms of what's going on in terms of maintenance, in terms of redistribution? We know we should do it. We focus on it on a circular economy, but are we measuring it? When we're looking at cascading and biochemicals, are we measuring that? We don't even measure all of the biochemicals that exist in the first place in the agricultural sector. We don't even know they exist, so how can we measure the recirculation of them? We need to think quite differently if we're going to try and understand the circular economy. Why do we need a circular economy? I'm not going to read in detail other than to say it's about economic benefits, it's about social benefits, and about environmental benefits. We all know that. That's why we're looking to go ahead and focus on implementing this as a core strategy going forward. But again, how do we look to measure that? If we're talking about loss of jobs, if we're talking about food poverty, if we're talking about reducing greenhouse gas levels, how do we actually measure that to know where we are now to whether we've made any improvement going forward? So when we're talking about an approach to measurement, there's three ways. Well, I put two ways there, but I added the third one in just before I come in the session, so I'll need to not edit slides too much beforehand. But three ways I think you can measure a circular economy: economic growth, material flows, or greenhouse gas accounting. So when we're talking around economic growth, we're talking around jobs, we're talking around industry, we're talking about GDP. So okay, those are reasonable things that we can measure. We're talking material flows, we're talking around inputs, outputs, and then losses and leakages. Really focusing on that word, losses and leakages, which is really key to when we're understanding a circular economy and the success of that circular economy, because we need to go round and round and round. We've seen all the diagrams about that. The other one, though, is greenhouse gas accounting. The question was asked by my colleague in the previous session, trying to allude to that. Is very much around where do we measure that greenhouse gas accounting? Is it the production or is it in the consumption phase in terms of those materials moving around? Again, remember, materials moving around is not in Australia, it's not in a council, it's global. It's a global materials market. We're seeing soared now, it's a global material market. So when we're trying to measure that, how are we going to do that globally to understand the success associated with that? We're in changing metrics, and what I mean by that is if we look at the metrics we use at the moment, we very much look about weight, we look at financial metrics, and we look to a little bit about the environmental metrics. So we look at things like recycling rates, diversion rates, recovery rates, waste generation rates. Why? Because they're easy to capture that information. It's tonnage based. It goes over a weighbridge. We know it goes that way, or it goes that way, divide one by the other. We've got a rate. It's easy to measure. Really key. We shouldn't stop measuring that. But if we're moving in those circles, we need to measure beyond that. Well, how are we going to measure that? Because that's no longer a tonnage-based measurement. When we look at financial, it's all about the delivery of service. So cost of service, cost per lift, cost per item. But when we're talking around circular economy, we're talking around adding value. Well, how do we measure that? So some of the things, and there's lots of those, and if I went back to that Ellen MacArthur diagram and picked up each of those points and thought, what does circular economy stand for? How do we measure some of those? It's all about adding value, valorization to the products. Well, how do we capture that data and information? We're talking about leakage out of the system. How do we capture that? About connectivity and collaboration. The previous speaker just talked about it. How do we put a value on putting everybody in touch with everyone and that connectivity? How do we measure that as a point of success? Service to a product business model. Very much businesses making money out of making less. Very different concept, but fundamentally the backbone of a circular economy. How do we then measure that as a point of success? And about longevity. The idea of a circular economy, it's not supposed to come into a system where we get hold of it. Well, if we can't see and get hold of it, how can we measure and understand the performance of it? You know, we need to really start thinking about some of these things. Now, one of the things that I find fascinating is data. Love data. Data, data everywhere. One of the great things about, I found this off the internet, so I hope I can use it. I think I put a source there, so there you go, I should be able to use it. But if you look at the amount of data we collect, this is a really fantastic quote. So 5 exabytes of information created in the world since the dawn of civilization. So this is 3000 BC. Same amount of data collected from then until 2003 is collected now every 2 days. Every 2 days. That is insane. That is absolutely insane on any level. That means data is collected everywhere. I know that I can't even go to the toilet without data being collected about. Is that where I've gone? People know what I buy, they know what I think, they know where I go, they know what I want to think. You've got Facebook up in court about things like that. But it's because of the power of data. How are we going to control that, use that going forward to our advantage to measure a circular economy? To be honest, I'd argue we've got the data at the moment through these things about what I buy, where I go, what I do, what the impact is. I'm sure me flying from the UK here had a nice carbon impact. How do I measure that in terms of the performance of my contribution to a circular economy? How do we incentivize change? This is going to be controversial, so I'm going to apologize in advance, but taxes. Taxes are really good to incentivize behavior, do things different. We should be taxing resources, not people. We've got less resources that we want to stop people using. Why are we taxing primary resources? Why are we going on the labour? We want to bring labour in to remanufacturing in terms of maintenance. Our taxes is in the wrong place. Primary resources tax. We've got primary aggregates tax in the UK. Actually, how can we put these materials on the level playing field so that we can start bringing secondary resources in? We've talked about specifications in the previous session around how can government bring that into product specification. How do we put those on a level playing field? Residual waste tax. Yeah, that's not going to be popular. We talk about landfill tax, but if we're talking about leakage, we're actually talking about residual waste. We've lost it out of the system. How do we tax that to keep it in the system and keep that reinvestment in the sector? What subsidies? What policy and regulation? How do we do that specification to make sure we use the materials to keep it in the sector as long as possible? And then more importantly, how do we measure that? Just a nice little infographic, again, pulled off the internet, but usually to sell a point is in terms of, are we focusing on the wrong thing? We talked about a collection. I got shot down quite quickly, as you noticed in that last session, but I think we really need to look at our collection systems. What are we collecting? Why are we collecting it? What's the value of what we're collecting? It's not about tonnage. We're focusing on quality, but what about impact? You know, we start collecting materials like cans. It accounts for 5% of the recycling bin, but about a third in terms of the carbon and energy use. Textiles in the UK, about 1% of the recycling level, but nearly a quarter in terms of the carbon impact of that. How do we bring that in to beneficial recycling when doing things different, when we're looking at collection system designs? How many people are collecting curbside around? But that's actually about having a positive impact in the environment. What are we trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? This is an index that we did in the UK as Ricardo, looking at saying, okay, if you applied a carbon factor across all local authorities and looked at their recycling rates and then looked at their carbon impact, actually high recyclers aren't actually having the best beneficial impact on the environment. Yeah, they're doing really well in terms of recycling, but they're not necessarily doing really well in terms of their impact on the environment because of the types of materials they collect and how they collect those materials. We need to think differently. We need to understand that, and how are we going to measure that? We need to think differently in terms of the impacts. Again, I pick up textiles here. If we look at the production phase of textiles, massive CO2, massive. So therefore, any solution to that Has to be around prevention, stop those entering the systems. We've heard some really good talks around reuse of textiles and exchange shops and all those kind of things. When we start looking at metallic and paper waste, and where's the best option for those, you start getting really interested again. Don't take this slide literally, don't take what I say literally here, but for example, we look at paper, you look at the amount of CO2 in the production of paper, we really need to stop trying to produce it in the first place. But when we've got it, is it better to landfill it? No, not really, because it now starts having an impact in CO2. But when we look at should we put it to energy, the paper, or should we recycle it? Well, of course we should recycle it, it's better. Is it better? Well, actually, you start looking at the carbon impact of it, you have some challenging questions there around, is it better to burn or recycle that material? I'm not advocating that that's what we should be doing, but what I'm saying we should do, as we're moving to a circular economy and the principles of that, we should be really starting to rethink the system around how we're trying to approach it. Now, we're doing some work for DEFRA and the ESA in the UK, really looking around how do you put these metrics in place. And this is some of the kind of criteria which we came up with. We're trying to understand what do you need for a good, successful metric. Well, you need to be easy to measure. You need to be easy to implement, communicate. It needs to be equitable. You need to offer consistency. It needs to be compatible with other benchmarks. If you can't compare it with something, how do you know you're improving? It needs to be translatable to other different markets. It needs to be comparable with other metrics that you're actually using. So it's all very well saying we need new metrics, but they need to be applicable and practical to actually use. What came out of that was a dashboard approach. It was a dashboard approach of saying there's a range of different metrics, about 6 metrics, which you can see on the screen there, which we're going to look to focus on, around performance, environmental, resource productivity, resource efficiency, producer responsibility, and then the social value associated with that. Those in more detail, I'm not going to necessarily go into too much detail because I'm conscious the session itself has started late, so I don't want to keep overrunning that. But when we start looking at those metrics in detail, we're starting to look very different around how we measure beneficial use in the sector in terms of waste. We're starting looking at carbon. We're starting to look at the value of waste generated per tonne. We're starting looking about social justice. Really different things that we're not used to measuring. One thing that was referenced in the first start talk this morning from the WARB was the metrics being done in terms of the the Commission, in terms of the monitoring framework. It's quite an interesting framework around starting to think what's the metrics of how we measure circular economy. So very much looking at 4 phases: production and consumption, waste management, second raw materials, and then competitiveness and innovation. Innovation, what's that got to do with waste? But it's got lots to do with circular economy. Well, how do we measure innovation? So just looking about those in turn, and I'll just very quickly talk you through these in turn, just to give you an example of how we should be thinking differently when we're talking in the circular economy. So we're talking production and consumption, we're talking around self-sufficiency, so making sure that the materials that we produce are then reused again and incorporated into the economy within the EU. We had self-sufficiency principle donkeys years ago, but about trying to measure that, bringing it into our thinking. Green public procurement. We've talked about that loads at this conference, so I won't go into the detail of that. Looking around the amount of generation, so generation of municipal waste per capita. Looking at it per GDP unit, so per GDP unit, how much waste is generated associated with that, where's the true value coming from? A really big focus on food waste, so how much food waste is actually generated. Big impact, how do we get it out? How do we measure against that? As you would expect, within that monitoring framework, there's indicators about waste management, so very much looking around overall recycling rates. But when we start looking at some of those on specific material streams, very much focus on packaging, plastic packaging, on so that's waste electronics, or e-waste as we're known over here, but very much then also on the recycled amount of bio-waste per capita, again, making it down to an individual, focusing on the organic bio-waste element. We're looking in terms of secondary raw materials, so what creates that stimulation and demand to use these secondary materials within the economy to keep that loop closed, having the metrics to encourage those behaviours to happen. So looking at the amount of secondary raw materials that are being used within the whole economy, looking at the imports and exports of selected raw materials. So what's coming in and out of the EU? How do we actually start to measure that to understand the performance that we're achieving? And then finally, looking at competitiveness and innovation. So starting to measure things like private investments, jobs. So how many investments are there? How many number of people are employed? Looking at the gross value added across those different types of sectors. In terms of patents, so how many new patents are there in waste management and recycling? Are we thinking different? Have we got innovation in place? So very different metrics. These are no longer measuring our recycling rate and our landfill diversion rate. We're looking completely different to understand as a system, how do we perform? Keeping an eye on the time, so I'm just going to finish up in terms of the next steps. But what we need to be really clear of when we're talking around how we measure in the circular economy, and I've gave some examples there of a broader way of approaching it as food for thought, excuse the pun, is they need to be very clear, measurable KPIs. We can come up with all these great ideas, but unless somebody can collect that data, it's pointless, it's worthless. But we need to be thinking around big data, Internet of Things, of how we can integrate that into our everyday lives and how we operate as an economy into how we measure success. But let's not forget, what's the baseline? We're going to go and do all this work, all this investment, make all this change, but without actually having a framework in place to measure where we are today. How are we going to know if we succeeded if we don't know where we actually started from? We communicate that in all our waste strategies. Get a baseline, and you can understand if you've improved. If we've not got clear of how we're going to measure circular economy now, how can we know whether we've achieved? How are we going to moderate and ensure consistency? This is a global market. This isn't a recycling rate for Australia or for the UK or China or wherever it is. This is a global economy. It's a global circular economy. How are we going to make sure globally we're going to understand whether we're performing? Common terminology. Let's be honest, we've got debates within Australia across states in terms of terminology. How are we going to do that across different countries to make sure we're all talking the same language in terms of measurement? Who's measuring it? Who's going to be enforced to measure it? Who's going to be incentivized to measure it? You know, there's a lot of things where we've got carrots lying on the ground. We don't want those things to come into the system. We almost want to keep quiet about that kind of stuff. Why are people going to suddenly start measuring this information? How are we going to force them to do it? Or encourage them, not force, encourage people to do it. How accessible is the data? And ultimately, I want to leave you with the last question is, what is our role as a sector? We talk about this as a waste management conference, we're a waste management sector. We've evolved from that. How are we going to evolve with that and be part of this journey in terms of measuring and delivering against a circular economy? Thank you very much for your time, and around at the conference for the conferences, questions now or later on, catch you over a drink. Thank you.